Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon on net zero is for tomorrow, carbon neutral is for now. We're just waiting for people to filter through, and then we'll get started in the next couple of minutes. Okay, we'll just give it 10 more seconds or so. Fantastic. So I think we've nearly hit kind of critical mass there. So I think we can make a start. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. Really great to have you along. So yeah, welcome to the webinar this afternoon on net zero is for tomorrow, carbon neutral is for now. So before we kind of get stuck into the agenda for today, just a few housekeeping points. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared with all attendees after the session this afternoon. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session as well, so please use the chat functionality of Zoom to add any questions that you may have as we go throughout the session today. Fantastic. So just in terms of introductions and who we're going to be hearing from today, we're joined by Chris Hucknall, Director and Founder of 8Versa, myself, Lead Footprint Consultant at 8Versa as well, and also Steve Dickinson, Head of Commercial from Ecology. So what is the agenda for the webinar this afternoon? Well, we want to kind of talk through the concept of carbon neutral and introduce some of the key themes that have come out around this concept, over the past couple of years, look towards how that standard has evolved and kind of tackle some of the controversies of carbon neutral head on. I'm going to be providing an overview of how standards relating to carbon neutral have evolved over time, looking specifically at the requirements of the now outdated PAS 2060 and the kind of evolution of that standard to ISO 14068. We're going to be touching on how carbon neutral can support an organization's net zero strategies and what are the alignment between the two there. Steve's going to then provide some detail on the role of mitigation, the role of credits as part of that journey towards achieving carbon neutral and net zero. And then we'll kind of finally run through what are the key milestones, what are the key steps towards achieving carbon neutrality. And then we'll kind of have a brief summary of what is the future of carbon neutral and net zero. And then hopefully we'll have time for questions towards the end as well. But Chris, I'll hand it over to you to provide that initial background of the concepts.
Thanks, Rob. So you've probably heard of carbon neutral for a number of years now, and it has been slipping out of favour, and there's been a lot of chatter about it in the last, say, 2 years. One of the key things we just want to get across here is that we want you to approach this with the mindset of a potential reset. And what we've alluded to is that there has been a complete change in standards and definitions. So this is a really big change, and we think it's a game changer. And now we have that integration with net zero, which is the key piece in the puzzle. And we think it can be a really powerful force for good. And we're going to explain why, but we have myself and Rob on the call from the environmental and carbon footprint perspective, and then we have Steve for all aspects related to carbon credits. So you are in safe hands, and please, if anyone wants to ask questions, please put them into the chat, and then we'll pick them up and we will get to them at the end. Okay, over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chris. So yeah, we wanted to kind of start off by tackling the kind of controversies around carbon neutral that have come to light in recent years, and kind of demystify some of those criticisms as well. So yeah, historic claims of carbon neutral and carbon neutrality have been heavily scrutinized, both here in the UK and at a European Union level as well. And that was very much scrutiny focused on the the now kind of outdated guidance around PAS 2060, where the definition of what it means to be carbon neutral was subjective in many ways. It was left open to interpretation in terms of what it actually meant to be carbon neutral in terms of the reductions and the level of carbon accounting that was needed. So, we've seen examples of many different organizations being accused of greenwashing, misleading consumers on the environmental impact that certain products do have on the environment. And in some cases at kind of European Union level, at a policy level, it would appear to suggest that there were leading kind of claims to ban carbon neutral by 2026. So that's just kind of highlighted by some of these headlines that we see on the screen now. Claims such as the EU is banning misleading environmental claims that rely purely on offsets, court cases relating to carbon neutral as well. So, it's been in the news. I'm sure everyone on the webinar today has seen some form of commentary on this recently as well. However, we've kind of drilled into the detail of that EU Green Directive as an example, and our perspective on this is that actually that directive isn't calling for an outright ban on carbon neutral claims. What it is doing, though, is setting out specific conditions that must be met when companies are going down the carbon neutrality route effectively. And some of these key kind of, I guess, requirements of a carbon neutral claim are listed on the screen there. So any claim at the European Union level must be based on clear, objective, and publicly available commitments, and that ensures transparency across any claims across the markets. Any carbon neutrality claim must then be accompanied by a detailed and realistic implementation plan. And that's really kind of saying that, alongside any claim of carbon neutrality, there must be a robust management plan in place, which says, what part does carbon neutral play in the overall journey to long-term production targets for that business. And of course, any carbon neutrality claims must then be verified by a third-party assurance business and an expert from the sustainability industry as well, again, to make sure that those claims are robust. So what the EU Green Directive is actually seeking to do is therefore improve the quality and authenticity of those carbon neutral claims, as opposed to, calling for an outright ban on carbon neutrality as a concept, as a claim, effectively. So a kind of a slight difference there in perhaps some of those headline statements that we saw on the previous slide. So I think we're at a really crucial time for kind of carbon neutral as a concept, and as we'll go through it in the later slides, with this new guidance, we do see this new standard of carbon neutral playing a key role in that transition to net zero. And this is a key opportunity now for businesses who may have aligned with PAS 2060, may have kind of held off doing anything in this space. Now we have this new guidance. Now's the time to update those commitments, push forward with those ambitions to ensure that any carbon neutral claims are credible and in line with those latest standards as well. Great. So just to kind of recap on what we mean by standards then. So previously, the definition of carbon neutral was defined by the British Standards Institute through the PAS 2060 standard. That will be retired at the end of 2025, and that's going to be superseded by the new ISO 14068 guidance, which we'll go through in later slides. The key message from a PAS 2060 perspective is that projects and entities wishing to kind of certify to carbon neutral should no longer use PAS 2060, and instead should turn their attention to this new standard, the ISO 14068. So it was released in 2023. It has been around for a couple of years now. The standard's now live and should now be considered as the most up-to-date guidance for carbon neutral certification. And as mentioned, any claims towards carbon neutral should now be followed and met with the new guidance here as well. So what are the key differences in the two standards, and has there been any evolution of those, and what are the differences there? So we've pulled together an initial list of just some of the key requirements across the two different standards, and we really wanted just to draw your attention to, yeah, how those standards have evolved and what the differences are between the two. So the first one to recognize here is that the new ISO standard is now a fully international standard. With PAS 2060, that was very much focused on the kind of British jurisdiction. It was a BSI, British Standards Institute standard. But now with this new ISO standard, we do have applicability across jurisdictions at the global level as well. A key development from PAS 2060 to ISO is that we now have a clear hierarchical approach to managing emissions across an entity. So there's a set process that needs to be followed now to achieve carbon neutrality, and that follows the kind of energy management hierarchy approach. So any entity or subject going through the new standard must initially reduce their emissions in line with the science. They then must remove the kind of demand for generating new emissions across the business as well. And then that's where kind of the mitigation and credits piece plays a final piece of the puzzle. Previously, as part of PAS 2060, there wasn't that clarity on the kind of hierarchical approach, and there wasn't that clarity on where offsets play a part in that as well. Again, previously with PAS 2060, companies could effectively offset their entire footprint and be awarded with a certification in year one. That's no longer the case. As mentioned, there is now a really kind of clear process in place for companies to achieve a carbon neutral certification. You do have to reduce emissions before, relying on credits in that sense. So there is a clear process in place, and we won't get companies or entities purely investing in mitigation being able to get a certificate off the back of that. Another key development is the boundary of the footprinting assessment for the subject as well. So it is now mandated through the new ISO guidance that any footprint that is developed must cover a full scope 1 to 3 value chain emissions inventory if you're an organization, and if you're a product, a full cradle to gate inventory as well. And that aligns with, the whole kind of concept around scope 3 emissions and the journey towards net zero. They are now absolutely intrinsic to this new guidance and must be measured and captured within any corporate carbon footprint in that sense. Off the back of that, then, the reductions to that measured footprint must follow best practice science-based pathways. So again, there's more of a structure in place now. We kind of have the per annum reductions that are required through this new standard. They must align with the science. They must kind of align with that longer term goal of getting to net zero, whereas previously in PAS 2060, again, there was kind of ambiguity on the level of reduction and the coverage of emissions that were kind of included within that. Another key evolution of the standard is when we kind of look towards actually target setting. So both short and long-term targets are now required as part of the new ISO guidance, and there needs to be a clear pathway to net zero. So what the new standard does acknowledge is net zero is our end point. That's kind of, the kind of situation and kind of, pathway to that. But as part of a credible carbon neutral submission and certification, there needs to be that pathway en route to net zero as well. And finally, there's a continuation of the importance of third-party verification. That's a critical part of getting kind of certified to carbon neutral. That third-party verification will be required for all claims as well. So just to kind of put that into a bit more of kind of a sense of where carbon neutral fits within the net zero kind of sphere. So if we take the kind of basic fundamentals of what makes up a net zero strategy, we know that it must include a full scope 1 to 3 footprint if you're an organization. Any reductions made as part of a strategy need to be science aligned. Those reductions need to be made across all scopes 1, 2, and 3. And any strategy regarding net zero must have a clear kind of pathway to that end point, and the steps to get there need to be clearly defined. So from our perspective, the guidance from ISO actually aligns with those key metrics that make up a net zero strategy. All of those points there are kind of directly referenced in the new standard. So, we see this new standard on carbon neutral being a really key part of the short-term journey to net zero. And we wanted to kind of explain that in a bit more of a visual way on this slide. So here we have a hypothetical emissions inventory pathway to net zero for a company. So in this case, let's call them company A. They have started to measure their corporate carbon footprint in 2024. They have developed their scope 1 to 3 footprint inventory. And they're at a point now, let's say in kind of 2025, where they would like to go down the carbon neutral route and they'd like to make a commitment to carbon neutral. So that's kind of the first line in the sand, if you like. The point at which they're able to claim carbon neutrality is a point where the emissions have reduced across the business, and the necessary investments in mitigation and credits have also been realized across the business in that sense. So another key point with this is that, as you see, we have the end point of net zero, but what a ongoing commitment to carbon neutrality will allow a business to do is meet their ongoing science-based targets and also the ongoing commitments of a carbon neutrality claim. So, over time, we can see the footprint of the organization in this case reducing to a point where they're in that kind of net zero state where there's only residual emissions left, and then kind of removal credits come into play there. So the key take home from this slide really is that, carbon neutral fits into meeting the short-term targets on that trajectory to net zero. Net zero is kind of the end point, the longer-term goal for every business. But in the short term, achieving carbon neutrality and completing that on an ongoing basis really provides the basis for that short-term action as well. So I'll hand it over to Steve now to talk through some of the key concepts relating to mitigation.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk to you briefly about two key things with this section of the presentation. So firstly, explaining the difference between unabated and residual emissions and how under the new standard these are going to be treated differently. And then I'm going to provide just some initial commentary on how to assess carbon credit quality, which thankfully in the new standard now is scrutinized, which is obviously a welcome change. So before any kind of offsetting is even considered, a company first needs to understand its unabated and residual emissions. This is an important point, and to be honest, it's one we'd recommend regardless of the new standard or any corporate standard. So without teaching anyone how to suck eggs on this slide, we've got a breakdown of what those two definitions mean. So unabated emissions are greenhouse gas emissions that continue to be produced, as the name suggests, because they haven't yet been abated, or in other words, reduced or removed by any kind of technology or process designed to cut those emissions at source. Residual emissions, albeit there's a bit of a grey area, these are greenhouse gas emissions that remain after an organization has taken all feasible actions, be it technically, scientifically, to reduce that carbon impact. So due to technological, economic, practical limitations, they cannot be eliminated entirely from their operation. So all carbon footprints, operational, product or otherwise, they will consist of a combination of unabated and residual emissions. And in simple terms, the objective is to decrease the unabated ratio through that decarbonisation effort and investment. So if we return, Rob, to that graph you presented on the previous slide, we've now split this footprint illustratively, I should say, the dark blue area by unabated and residual emissions. And as a company's data accuracy and granularity improves, their maturity develops, their ability to identify what is residual and what is unabated will increase. And over time, we'd expect that unabated ratio to decrease as the carbon reduction plan is delivered. Why is all of that important in the context of offsetting with the new standard? Whilst the standard rightly endorses a reduction first policy, it now stipulates that both unabated and residual emissions need to be counterbalanced. What it also does is make a distinction on how to compensate depending on that emission type. So as you can see in that light blue area at the base of the graph, which represents the offsetting requirements mirroring the footprint volume, it's now split between carbon avoidance and carbon removal. So Rob, on the next slide, we've put a summary again using each. So moving forward under the new standard, the unabated emissions in your footprint can be mitigated through carbon avoidance credits, and the residual emissions in the footprint must be offset through carbon removal credits. And this is a significant shift compared to past 2060, where the only distinction made was that you had to mitigate scope 1 and scope 2, regardless of unabated or residual, and critically scope 3 was not included. Neither was any consideration for the quality of the carbon credit. I should say, by the way, at Ecology, we aren't necessarily advocating for that offsetting guidance. We're still assessing it, but what we want to make clear is this is what the ISO standard is stipulating and what you need to plan for should you wish to seek that certification. I mentioned quality on that previous commentary. Not all carbon credits are created equal. There are good credits, there are bad credits, there are sadly downright ugly credits, and it's been well reported, badly reported as well for that matter, that carbon credits have had a difficult history. At their worst, they can greenwash polluting activity, they can provide no additional reduction or removal in actual emissions, and they can encourage the wrong behaviour when implemented incorrectly. However, when implemented properly, in line with the highest carbon standards and as part of that wider reduction strategy, they remain a vital contributing mechanism to get much needed funding to projects around the world. And on this next slide, the new standard will account for quality and carbon credit integrity. So the days of purchasing the cheapest credits are numbered, and the adage of what you get what you pay for is could not be truer in the voluntary carbon market. So we could dedicate a full webinar just to this slide, really, but to briefly comment on each of these 6 steps, which we provided a high-level summary of to ensure a high standard credit. Take a portfolio approach that funds a diverse range of projects. This aligns to the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting Guidance, which were updated earlier this year, and endorse that move towards carbon removals, amongst other things. Hold your vendors and providers to account. Ask them for evidence on things like additionality, leakage, permanence, durability. We don't have time to go into the meaning of all these things, but they're important. So make a note of them as indicators of quality. We'd advise you to prioritize investment in projects that have an impact beyond carbon, such as supporting social and economic development, UN SDGs. Of course, we're talking about carbon, and there can be a bit of an obsession with this carbon tunnel vision, but that can distract from other critically important sustainability themes, most notably nature. So credits represent an opportunity to protect and restore ecosystems and develop that wider climate resilience and funding biodiversity. Vintage, meaning the year that reduction or removal occurred or received verification. This is important. And as verification methodologies are under review, our recommendation would be to support vintages of less than 5 years. And finally, seek third-party agency rating verification. There's lots of examples I've listed here. All of them assess something slightly different, but the key point being they should have some level of third party, so we're not just marking our own homework. That's an introduction to the role of credits in the new standard. I'll hand back over to Rob and Chris to summarize that certification process.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Steve. So yeah, we've been through quite a lot already in the webinar today. So we've kind of introduced the concept of carbon neutral. We talked through some of the evolution of the standards themselves. Steve there has then provided some clarity on best practice from a mitigation perspective. So what are the key steps towards actually achieving carbon neutral certification for an entity that wishes to do so? So the first piece of that puzzle, the first step, is really defining the subject and the boundary alongside that. So is it an organization? Is it a product? Is it an event that wishes to achieve certification? The first key thing then is developing a full footprint inventory for all relevant categories, and that includes all scope 1 to 3, and includes all relevant categories there. Once you have that initial footprint and understanding of the hotspots of the business or the product, the next key step then is developing a carbon neutrality management plan. And this is where a lot of the detail around, how the business is going to achieve carbon neutrality, how it's going to achieve the longer term goal of net zero, all of the detail regarding that needs to be clearly laid out in that management plan. And within that step, there are another kind of set of requirements, if you like, in terms of what that report should entail. One of those is, of course, committing to near and long-term reduction targets and aligning those to science-based pathways, again, with net zero in mind. All of the reductions need to be aligned to that. Once you've got that plan in place, you've got your targets there, you've got kind of a pathway to net zero in that sense, you then need to actually achieve those reductions across the defined subject. And that's where measures to reduce emissions are really critical. You need to be able to achieve that set level of reduction to actually get awarded with a certification. Once you've followed that kind of hierarchical approach to reduction, that's where the role of high quality credits comes into play, and carefully considering what mitigation the business would like to look at and consider. That's the part of the puzzle there. And then that's where the third party verification of not just the credits but also the claim itself is really important. And kind of on an ongoing basis, companies should always update their management plans on a yearly basis and provide full transparency on any progress that's made across the business as well. So they're just some of the key steps towards kind of getting certified. Natural Carbon Solutions, who is the official verification partner of Versa, are releasing their version 2 of their kind of protocol at the middle to end of this month, where there will be the ability to get certified to carbon neutral through Natural Carbon Solutions. So yeah, further information on that protocol will be circulated after this webinar, but there is a route to getting certified through an independent third party verifier in that sense as well. Fantastic. So we just wanted to wrap up the webinar today, really just kind of looking towards the future of carbon neutral and just wrapping up with some key messages from the session today. So absolutely, one of the key messages is, companies that did align with PAS 2060 now need to update those commitments to the new ISO standard. That should be an action and a commitment that's happening today. The ISO standard is live. It's ready for kind of people to use and align with. That's the first key message there. What this new standard really kind of builds on, and we see it as a direct kind of mechanism towards achieving net zero. It provides a framework for robust short-term action, and in some cases, will actually prevent any delays in action. As I said, net zero is kind of often considered that longer-term goal. But with this new standard, there is now a kind of a rule book on what actions can be taken in the short term. A lot of the concerns and kind of subjectivity around carbon neutral, we believe have now been addressed as part of this new standard. There's been a lot of kind of tightening up of the definition, the level of reduction that's needed, the scope of the emissions inventory as well. And that's a really positive thing that has been addressed. Crucially, carbon neutral shouldn't be viewed as a one-off milestone, a one-off certification. The way that this new standard has been set up is that it should be considered as a continual certification, continual milestone that should be used as a supportive mechanism on the journey to net zero. As we saw on that graph, a continual reduction in emissions, a continual kind of alignment with carbon neutral will support that overall journey to net zero in that sense. Another key point to highlight is that science-aligned emissions reduction are absolutely critical and a key part of this new standard. and should always be considered as a priority for investing in mitigation, and that aligns with the hierarchical approach to energy management and carbon management in that sense. And I think finally, it's kind of worth acknowledging the fact that, carbon neutral is by no means the end goal. Everyone needs to achieve net zero emissions. We all need to get there as a business, as a product. What it does do, as mentioned, is it provides companies, products with an intermediate pathway to developing robust short-term actions on the route to net zero as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the webinar this afternoon, a whistle-stop tour of carbon neutral. We will be sending through the slides and the recording after the session today. We have hit time, so if there are any questions, please do drop those into the chat, and we will make sure to circulate those back, get back to everyone with a list of questions as well. But yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.